The chandeliers shimmered like frozen rain above her head, but all Natalie could feel was the weight of eyes pretending not to see her. 1,000 crystal lights, 1,000 shallow smiles, and her name written in elegant calligraphy on a single place card that might as well have read, "Unwanted." She stood there, clutching that little card with her one trembling hand, as if holding on to proof that she existed. The waiter's polite voice was coated in discomfort when he guided her to the farthest corner of the room, behind a dying palm tree, beside the stack of folded chairs, where the hum of the celebration barely reached. It was her sister's wedding, yet the seat assigned to her was one for ghosts. Laughter rippled across the golden hall, violins floated through the air like gentle ribbons, and the scent of champagne and lilies wrapped around every guest but her. Natalie adjusted the strap of her beige dress, the color chosen because it drew no attention. 10 years of invisibility had taught her how to fade, how to breathe quietly, how to exist without sound. Still, as she walked across the marble floor, the murmur of whispers followed her, sharp as glass. Someone gasped softly, another looked away. They didn't see the girl who once danced barefoot in the rain. They saw a reminder of tragedy, a blemish on perfection. The seat was waiting, cold, small, forgotten. She placed her card on the tablecloth that fluttered under the air conditioner's breath, then sat down, spine straight, chin lifted, dignity worn like fragile armor. The room shimmered with people who once called her family, yet none looked her way. Her sister, radiant in silk and diamonds, raised a glass at the head table, pretending not to notice the empty seat that separated their worlds. Natalie smiled anyway, because sometimes survival wears the mask of grace. Inside, she was breaking quietly, the kind of breaking that makes no sound but changes everything. She reached for the water glass, her only hand trembling, and caught her reflection in the liquid shimmer, half a girl, half a ghost, trying to remember the last time someone had looked at her without pity. For years she'd lived under their roof, but outside their love. Every laugh at her expense, every "poor dear" whispered just loud enough to sting, had become a stone in the wall that now surrounded her. 10 years of pretending she didn't hear, didn't feel, didn't need. 10 years of learning that silence was safer than truth. Then came the voice. Low, calm, carrying something she hadn't heard in years. Gentleness. "Excuse me." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it cut through the noise like sunlight through storm clouds. She looked up and saw him, a man in a modest grey suit, standing in the glow of 1,000 chandeliers, as if they'd been lit just for this moment. He looked ordinary at first glance, but his eyes, warm, steady, kind, made her heart stumble. Something about him felt like safety, like a familiar song she had forgotten the melody of. He smiled, soft but sure, and said, "Would you do me a favor?" Her instinct screamed to retreat. People only spoke to her when they wanted to remind her where she belonged, somewhere out of sight. But this man wasn't like them. His tone carried no pity, only a quiet courage. "My name's Robert," he added, gesturing toward the lively table across the room. "I work with the groom. I noticed you're sitting here alone. My daughter, she's 7, made me promise to make a new friend tonight. She worries about me being lonely." Lonely? The word landed between them like a confession. Natalie blinked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "It's fine," she murmured automatically, the practiced response of someone who's learned that pain should never inconvenience others. But he didn't leave. He pulled out the chair across from her, as if this had been his table all along, as if sitting with her was the most natural thing in the world. "You'd really be helping me out," he said, eyes glimmering with something that looked suspiciously like sincerity. "Act like you're with me, please." 6 words. That was all. But they reached straight into the hollow of her chest, where hope had long gone silent. She searched his face for mockery, cruelty, pity, found none. Only a man whose sadness mirrored her own, whose kindness carried the weight of someone who had known loss and refused to let it harden him. She hesitated. The ballroom was still humming with shallow laughter, but for the first time she felt the music slow, as if the world itself was waiting for her answer. Slowly, her lips parted. "All right," she whispered. Robert's smile deepened. Not wide, not smug, just real. He rose and offered his arm. For a moment she couldn't move. No one had ever offered her an arm before. Not since the accident. Not since she became the reminder everyone tried to forget. "People will stare," she warned softly. "Let them," he said simply, and in that instant something healed, quietly, invisibly. A wound she hadn't realized was still bleeding began to close. She placed her trembling hand in the crook of his arm, and together they began the slow, impossible walk across the ballroom. The whispers began at once, rippling through the crowd like wind through silk. Some gasped. Some smiled, scandal blooming behind their perfect teeth. But she didn't look away. Not this time. The chandeliers above seemed to burn brighter, the violins swelling as though the universe itself approved of this rebellion. At his table, people stared, shocked, speechless. Robert introduced her calmly, like she was an old friend. "This is Natalie," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice made her throat tighten. It was the first time in years her name hadn't sounded like an apology. Every moment after that felt like learning to breathe again. He poured her a glass of champagne. He asked about her favorite books. He laughed softly when she said she hadn't read much lately. No one at the table dared speak against it, not while his quiet confidence held the air in balance. For the first time, she didn't feel like furniture in someone else's life. She felt present, seen, alive. And as she looked across the hall, her sister's cold eyes burning with outrage, Natalie realized that perhaps grace wasn't about being silent in the face of cruelty. Perhaps grace was standing tall when kindness called your name. Somewhere near the band, a little girl's laughter rang out, Robert's daughter, waving from her seat, grinning wide enough to make Natalie smile for real. The music softened, the lights dimmed, and for a fleeting moment the lonely seat behind the palm tree no longer existed. That night, under the watchful eyes of chandeliers and judgment, 2 souls found a quiet beginning. She didn't know yet that his 6 words would rewrite the rest of her life, that from the ruins of shame would bloom something gentle, healing, and eternal. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks or fairy tales. Sometimes it begins with a simple act of kindness, a man who stood up, a woman who dared to believe again, and 6 words that made the world stop and listen. If this moment touched your heart, leave a little light behind. A comment, a like, a whisper of warmth to remind others that kindness still changes everything. And if you believe in stories that heal, stay close. The next chapter is already waiting. just beyond the music. Robert had never believed in fate, but when he saw her sitting alone beneath that tired palm, something ancient and wordless rose inside him. A quiet revolt against cruelty disguised as manners. The air shimmered with wealth and hypocrisy, but his gaze stayed fixed on her, the girl in beige, the one trying to disappear. Her shoulders were straight, but her loneliness was loud enough to shake something in his chest that hadn't stirred since Patricia's funeral. He didn't stand up to make a scene. He stood up because he couldn't sit still in a room that had decided silence was acceptable. Every step toward her felt heavier than the last, as though the polished floor was made of wet earth, pulling him down with each stride. He could hear the orchestra playing a waltz, the clinking of glasses, the laughter of people who measured compassion by convenience. But in the center of all that glitter, there was her, alone, trembling, pretending not to notice how the waiter avoided her eyes. Robert loosened his tie and exhaled. He didn't know what he was about to do, only that he had to do it. When she placed her hand in the crook of his arm, he felt her hesitate, the faint tremor that betrayed a decade of flinching at every gesture of kindness. "Let them stare," he'd said, and meant it. The weight of her trust settled between them like fragile glass, delicate, precious, and more real than anything in that ballroom. They walked through the sea of whispers. People turned their heads, the way one does when the order of things is suddenly disturbed. A woman in emerald silk whispered to her husband, "Isn't that the Whitfields' girl?" Another murmured, "Did you hear what happened to her arm?" But Robert kept walking, steady, unhurried, a quiet defiance against all of it. Natalie, for the first time, didn't lower her head. The music carried them forward like a tide refusing to let go. At his table, the conversation faltered. The group of accountants and colleagues blinked up at him as if he'd dragged in a thunderstorm. Robert smiled lightly, the way one does to ease tension, but there was steel beneath it. "Everyone," he said with gentle authority, "this is Natalie." Her name rolled through the air like a bell. She gave a small nod, unsure what to do with so many eyes on her. Margaret, from accounting, blinked, the rim of her glass frozen halfway to her lips. James coughed into his napkin. Nobody spoke. For a heartbeat, it was awkward. Then Robert chuckled softly, as if the silence itself amused him, and something in his tone broke the spell. Conversation resumed in hesitant ripples. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "They mean well. They're just shocked anyone decent showed up at this wedding." Natalie's lips twitched, the smallest of smiles, but genuine. It felt strange, like stretching muscles she'd forgotten she had. "You don't seem like the kind of man who enjoys weddings," she said. "I don't," he admitted, "but my daughter insisted I come. She said I should try being happy around other people for once." That confession, simple, honest, softened her. There was something healing about his openness, the way he spoke as if they were equals, as if she wasn't something to be pitied or saved. Just seen. "Your daughter sounds wise," Natalie said quietly. "Too wise," he answered with a faint laugh. 7 going on 70. Her name's Abigail. She thinks I'm lonely." Natalie's eyes flickered down to her hands. "Are you?" He paused, then nodded. "I was." Something in the way he said it, the past tense, warmed the space between them. They talked, at first about nothing. The music, the food, the absurdity of expensive weddings where everyone pretends to be happy. But beneath the small talk there was something blooming, slow and steady, like dawn creeping into a long winter night. Each word seemed to peel back a layer of her silence, and Robert found himself laughing at things that weren't even funny, just alive. He noticed the way her eyes changed colour under the light, dark coffee when she was guarded, but soft amber when she relaxed. He noticed how careful she was, how every movement seemed rehearsed to avoid drawing attention, and he hated that the world had made her that way. At one point, the bride's laughter pierced the air, sharp, brittle, like crystal breaking. Veronica's gaze landed on them from across the room, and Robert saw it. The satisfaction she'd worn earlier replaced by something colder. He held Natalie's gaze, steady and calm, silently saying, "You're safe here." For a moment, she believed him. Then came the storm. Eleanor Whitfield approached. Elegance sharpened into cruelty, her heels striking the marble like warning bells. Her husband trailed behind her, his smile clumsy from too much champagne. The conversation at their table stopped instantly. Robert could feel Natalie shrinking beside him, her breath quickening, that familiar submission returning like a reflex. "Mrs. Whitfield," Robert greeted, rising slightly. "Beautiful wedding." Eleanor's eyes didn't even glance at him. They were fixed on Natalie. "What do you think you're doing?" Her voice was low, but lethal. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Robert stepped forward, positioning himself just enough to block Eleanor's direct line of fire. "I invited her," he said. "She's my guest." Eleanor's lips curved in something that might have been a smile in another world. "A misunderstanding, surely. This is a family celebration. You don't understand the circumstances." "Then explain them to me," Robert said evenly. Her composure cracked. "We took her in out of kindness," she said, gesturing toward Natalie like presenting a piece of furniture. "She should be grateful. Without us, she'd have nothing." "Without you," Robert said softly, "she'd have peace." The room gasped, not loudly, but collectively, like an inhale of conscience. Harold Whitfield's face darkened to purple. He started ranting about generosity, about charity, about how they'd given her everything. Natalie's fingers dug into her lap, trembling. Then her voice, small but steady, cut through his words. "You gave me a room. You never gave me a place." It was barely a whisper, but it silenced them all. For 10 years she had swallowed her pain, built walls out of politeness. But in that moment, something inside her broke. Not the fragile kind of breaking, but the kind that sets you free. "You introduced me as a charity case," she said, her voice rising with strength she didn't know she had. "You told people I should be grateful for what I got. You let them laugh. You never stopped them." Eleanor's fury faltered for the first time. The cracks were showing. Robert stood beside Natalie, his hand steady on the table, ready if she needed him. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His silence said everything. "You're not alone anymore." Then, like divine justice, the grandmother of the groom rose from her chair, walker clacking, voice fierce and trembling with truth. "I remember the headlines," she said. "Harold Whitfield, the kind philanthropist adopting the orphan girl, right after he fired half his staff before Christmas. Don't you dare call that kindness." The entire hall erupted in murmurs. The orchestra stopped mid-note. The truth had found its voice. and it echoed through every chandelier and crystal glass in the room. Eleanor sputtered. Veronica hissed something about humiliation, and Harold demanded security. But it was too late. The illusion had shattered. The guests who once turned away were now watching with unveiled disgust. Natalie rose slowly, her chin lifted high, trembling but defiant. "I need some air," she whispered. Robert followed her out, the noise behind them fading into the distance. The night was cool on the terrace, moonlight spilling over marble railings like liquid silver. Natalie leaned against the stone, shaking. The world that had defined her for a decade had just collapsed. And yet, for the first time, she could breathe. The silence felt different now. It wasn't empty. It was healing. Robert stood beside her, not touching, just existing in the same quiet space. "Tell me about them," he said gently. She hesitated, then began, haltingly at first, then like a river breaking through a dam. The accident, the adoption, the years of careful cruelty dressed in charity. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. He listened, truly listened. And when she finally fell silent, he said, "You deserved better." Tears slid down her cheek, soft and unashamed. He didn't reach to wipe them. He just let her cry, because sometimes healing isn't about comfort. It's about being allowed to feel. "I lost my wife 3 years ago," he said quietly. "Brain aneurysm. She was laughing one minute, gone the next. Since then, people keep telling me to move on, to forget. But you don't forget love. You just learn to carry it differently." Natalie turned toward him, her eyes full of fragile understanding. "You miss her?" "Every day," he said. "But tonight, for the first time, I didn't feel like I was grieving. I just felt human." She smiled. Small, broken, beautiful. "Maybe that's enough." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's the beginning." And in that moment, the night no longer felt cold. The stars above them didn't look so far away. They stood in silence. Two souls that had lived too long in pain, finally standing in the same gentle light. Behind the glass doors, chaos raged. Inside, reputations burned. But out here, something softer was taking root, something like peace, like forgiveness, like the faint sound of healing beginning to hum beneath the noise. The story was only starting to unfold, and though neither of them knew it yet, that single act of kindness would soon become the foundation of a life rebuilt, not out of pity or duty, but out of love, chosen freely, courageously, and without condition. The world inside the Whitfield mansion fell away the moment Natalie stepped into the night. Cool air wrapped around her like mercy, soft and trembling after the storm that had just ripped through the ballroom. The sound of laughter, of crystal glasses clinking, of whispers sharpened into knives. All of it was muffled now behind thick glass doors. She pressed her bare shoulder against the cold stone of the terrace railing and exhaled, her breath fogging in the silver moonlight. 10 years of humiliation had been swallowed in silence. Tonight it had finally been released, raw and unstoppable, like water bursting through a broken dam. Her chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. The anger had burned through her veins like fire, but what remained now was exhaustion, that deep kind of tiredness that comes not from the body, but from the soul. Still, beneath the ache, there was something else blooming, a strange, unfamiliar lightness. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was freedom beginning to stretch its wings inside her ribcage. Robert stood a few feet away, hands tucked into his pockets, giving her space but never distance. The moonlight caught the faint streaks of grey at his temples, softened the lines around his mouth. He wasn't watching her the way others did. Not with curiosity, not with pity. He simply was, steady and present, like a calm tide waiting to carry her home. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally, his voice low, warm, careful. She shook her head, the motions slow. "No," she whispered. "I just wish it hadn't taken so long." He nodded, looking out over the garden. "It always takes longer than we think, finding the strength to stop apologizing for existing." That simple truth cut deeper than anything her family had said all night. Tears threatened again, but these were different. They weren't born of pain. They were the kind that came when someone finally said out loud what you've always been too afraid to believe. He turned to her then, the distance between them closing like a breath. "You were incredible in there," she let out a trembling laugh. "I was terrified." "Courage isn't about not being afraid," he said. "It's about standing up anyway." The words lingered, weaving through the cool air like incense. She wanted to say thank you, but thank you felt too small for what he'd done, for how he'd seen her when no one else dared. So instead she said nothing, and the silence between them became a kind of prayer. The garden beyond the terrace was quiet except for the hum of distant crickets. A soft wind brushed against the wisteria vines that climbed the stone columns, scattering petals across the floor. Natalie reached down, absent-mindedly catching one between her fingers. It was delicate, but it didn't crumble under her touch. She smiled faintly. "When I was a little girl," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "my mother used to tell me that storms were God's way of shaking loose what didn't belong anymore. Maybe that's what tonight was." Robert's gaze softened. Maybe it was. She turned to face him fully. "Why did you do it? You didn't even know me." He hesitated, searching for words that felt honest enough. "Because you reminded me of someone who once saved me," he said. "My wife, Patricia. She had this way of noticing people everyone else ignored. If she were here tonight, she'd have done exactly what I did, only faster and with more grace." The tenderness in his voice wrapped around Natalie like warmth. She wanted to ask more, but the look in his eyes, that ache laced with memory, made her stop. Some griefs were sacred. Instead, she said softly, "She sounds extraordinary." "She was," he said, a wistful smile ghosting across his lips. "But I think she'd like you. She'd tell me to stop staring at the past and start paying attention to the living." The night held them in its gentle hush. Two souls bruised in different ways, both beginning to breathe again. For a long time, neither spoke. It wasn't awkward. It was healing. The kind of silence that doesn't demand, only gives. Eventually, Natalie sighed. "I should probably go back inside, pretend I didn't just dismantle an empire with my words." Robert chuckled. "You don't have to pretend anything anymore." She glanced through the glass doors where shadows of chaos still danced. Eleanor's furious gestures, Veronica's tears, the guest's restless movement. It all looked so small now, like a stage play whose script she'd finally stopped reading. "You're right," she murmured. "I don't." When she turned back, Robert was closer, not enough to invade, just enough for her to feel the safety radiating from him. The faint smell of cedar and clean linen clung to him. His presence grounded her. "You should know," he said, "that what you did tonight, it mattered. People will remember it." "I didn't do it for them," she said quietly. "I know," he replied, smiling gently. "That's why it matters even more." Her gaze met his, steady now, no longer trembling. In his eyes she saw something she hadn't known she was still searching for, the reflection of a future that didn't hurt to imagine. They stood like that for what felt like forever, two strangers connected by something that wasn't yet love but carried its seed. And maybe that was enough for now. Healing rarely arrives all at once. It grows slowly, like dawn creeping into a room that's been dark too long. Inside, the music faltered, voices rising again, the broken remnants of a party still pretending everything was fine. But Natalie knew it was over. Not just the night, but the years of pretending, of shrinking, of surviving instead of living. She straightened her shoulders, feeling the faint ache where her missing arm used to be. Not shame anymore, but strength. Her scars had stopped being a secret. They had become proof that she endured. Robert watched her quietly, sensing the shift even before she did. "You're different," he said softly. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe I'm just remembering who I was before they made me forget." He nodded, his smile full of quiet pride. "You should keep that version of you. She's remarkable." A warmth spread through her chest, slow and steady, dissolving the last fragments of fear. For the first time in years, she felt something gentle and hopeful flutter inside her, something like belonging. As they walked back through the garden toward the distant glow of the parking lot, Robert offered her his jacket. She hesitated for a moment, then accepted it, draping it over her shoulders. It was far too big, but somehow it fit perfectly. The night air grew cooler, the scent of rain drifting from the hills beyond the mansion. Somewhere, thunder grumbled faintly, a soft reminder that storms don't end in destruction. Sometimes they clear the air. By the time they reached the gravel path, the music behind them had faded completely. The lights of the Whitfield estate gleamed distant and cold, but ahead, beyond the curve of the road, the town's modest street lamps flickered like fireflies. "I can give you a ride home," Robert said. "It's late." Natalie nodded, exhaustion pressing gently at her bones. "Thank you," he smiled, unlocking the car. "Don't thank me. Just rest." She leaned back against the seat, the hum of the engine blending with the rhythm of the night. Outside, the dark trees blurred past like watercolor. Inside, a quiet peace began to settle, fragile but real. Robert glanced at her once, saw her eyelids fluttering, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. He looked away quickly, not wanting to disturb the calm. But inside, something in him had shifted too. He hadn't planned to care again. Not this deeply, not this soon. Yet here he was, driving through the quiet streets with someone who reminded him that gentleness was still worth offering. When he pulled up to the gate of the Whitfield property, she hesitated before getting out. "Robert?" He turned to her. "Thank you," she said softly. her voice trembling not from fear, but from the enormity of what gratitude meant after so many years of silence. He met her gaze, steady and kind. "Get some sleep, Natalie. Tomorrow will be lighter." She nodded, stepping out into the faint drizzle that had begun to fall. As she walked toward the grand but hollow house, Robert watched her through the windshield, a lone figure crossing the courtyard with quiet dignity. He didn't know it yet, but he'd never forget that image. The girl who walked away from cruelty under the rain, wearing his jacket and the fragile beginnings of freedom. Inside, Natalie closed her bedroom door, leaned against it, and let herself exhale. The house was silent, heavy with unspoken rage upstairs, but she didn't care anymore. She was no longer the girl they could hide behind their charity. She looked out the window at the faint glow of Robert's car headlights disappearing down the road. Something inside her whispered, "You're not alone anymore." And though she didn't yet understand what those 6 words, "Act like you're with me, please," would truly come to mean, she could feel them taking root, warm and alive beneath the ashes of her old life. Outside, the rain began to fall in earnest, washing the night clean. It sounded like forgiveness, like promise, like the beginning of everything new. Morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, painting quiet gold patterns on the walls of Natalie's small room. The house felt different now, colder, emptier, but not in a way that frightened her anymore. It was as if the storm from the night before had washed away the illusion that love had ever lived here. The Whitfields moved like ghosts through their marble corridors that morning, avoiding her gaze, their perfect world cracked open for everyone to see. She could hear Veronica sobbing faintly in another wing, Eleanor's clipped voice trying to contain the scandal, and Harold's booming anger echoing through the hall like the last roar of a fading empire. Natalie folded her few belongings into a small bag, careful and calm. There wasn't much to pack. Some clothes, a few books, and a faded photograph of her parents she kept hidden behind the nightstand. Each item carried years of silence, yet none of it weighed as heavily as it once had. For the first time in 10 years, she wasn't afraid of leaving. The house that had once been a cage now felt like a door waiting to be closed. Her phone buzzed on the dresser. The name on the screen made her chest tighten. Robert. She hesitated before answering, still half afraid the kindness of last night had been a dream that would crumble in daylight. But when his voice came through, gentle and sure, it steadied her. "I heard," he said quietly. "Are you all right?" "I will be," she replied. There was a pause, soft, full of unspoken care. Then, "If you need somewhere to go, we have space. My daughter would love the company." She wanted to say no, to insist she could handle it, that she didn't want to impose. But her heart betrayed her mouth. "Thank you," she whispered. That afternoon, a storm gathered over the hills again. The air felt heavy, electric, as if the universe itself was rearranging something unseen. When Robert's old sedan rolled into the driveway, the rain had just begun to fall, gentle at first, then insistent, washing the world clean. Eleanor didn't come downstairs. Harold stayed in his study. Only Veronica stood at the door, wrapped in a silk robe, mascara streaked like war paint. She looked smaller than Natalie remembered, fragile in her own way, her voice flat when she spoke. "You've ruined everything." Natalie looked at her for a long moment. There was no hatred left, only a kind of weary compassion. "No," she said softly. "You ruined it the day you made me eat alone." Robert appeared behind her, lifting the 2 worn suitcases into his trunk. His presence felt like a shield against the cold. Abigail peeked from the back seat, waving shyly. "Hi, Miss Natalie." Veronica sneered at the child, but Robert's steady voice cut through the tension. "You should be kind, Veronica. Your daughter might grow up to remind you what love actually looks like." Natalie didn't look back as she climbed into the car. Raindrops streaked the windows like blessings. When they pulled away, the mansion grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it vanished behind the mist. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was leaving something behind. She felt like she was heading somewhere that wanted her. The Sinclair house was nothing like the Whitfields' sterile palace. It was a modest colonial on a quiet street, with chipped paint, an overgrown garden, and laughter lingering in the air like music. The moment she stepped through the door, warmth wrapped around her, not just the kind that comes from heating vents, but the kind that lives in photographs on walls and handmade drawings taped to the fridge. Abigail ran ahead, her tiny footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. "This way. I'll show you your room." Robert smiled. "It's small," he said, carrying her bags upstairs, "but it's yours." When he opened the door, Natalie froze. The room was simple. A twin bed with a patchwork quilt, a small window overlooking the backyard where daffodils were struggling through the damp earth. But it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. For 10 years she had lived in a mansion without ever belonging. Here, in this little room, belonging waited quietly for her to claim it. She touched the quilt, feeling the softness beneath her fingers. "It's perfect," she murmured. That first night, they ate spaghetti from mismatched plates. Abigail chattered endlessly about school, her friends, and the tooth she'd recently lost. Robert listened with patient warmth, laughing when she smeared sauce across her cheek. He looked at Natalie then, an unspoken question in his eyes. Is this too much? Too new? But Natalie only smiled. "She's wonderful," she said softly. "She gets it from her mother," he replied, a shadow of grief passing across his face, quickly replaced by something gentler. When dinner was over, Abigail dragged Natalie to the living room to show her the family photos. "That's Mommy," the little girl said, pointing at a picture of a woman with kind eyes and a smile like sunrise. Natalie felt her throat tighten. "She looks like she loved deeply," she said. "She did," Robert answered quietly from behind her. "And she'd have loved you too." Later that night, when the house had gone quiet, Natalie sat on the porch with a cup of tea. Rain still dripped from the eaves, the smell of wet grass and cedar filling the air. Robert joined her, carrying 2 blankets. He draped one around her shoulders before sitting down beside her. "It's strange," she said, after a long silence. "Feeling safe." He nodded slowly. "You get used to it. Then you wonder how you ever lived without it." The wind stirred the chimes above them, a soft, tinkling melody that filled the spaces their words didn't need to. They sat like that for a long time, 2 people learning how to exist in the gentle quiet after pain. Days slipped into weeks, and slowly Natalie began to bloom again. She helped Abigail with homework, cooked dinners when Robert worked late, and planted flowers in the neglected garden. The girl adored her, following her everywhere, asking endless questions about stories and stars. And in between laughter and late-night conversations, something began to grow between Natalie and Robert. A tenderness both of them pretended not to notice at first, as if naming it too soon might scare it away. He would watch her sometimes from across the kitchen table, the way her eyes softened when Abigail laughed, the way sunlight caught in her hair. He'd forgotten what it felt like to have another adult in the house who filled the silence not with noise but with calm. She, in turn, found comfort in the steadiness of him, the way he fixed squeaky doors, the way he carried his grief with quiet dignity, the way he never once looked at her with pity. His presence became her anchor, his voice the sound her heart learned to rest against. One afternoon, months later, she found a stack of old recipe cards tucked in a drawer, handwritten in neat cursive, labelled Patricia's favourites. She began cooking from them, not to replace the woman who'd come before her, but to honour her. When Robert came home to the smell of chicken soup and thyme, he froze in the doorway, eyes glassy. "She wrote that recipe her last year," he said softly. "I know," Natalie whispered. "I wanted to bring her into dinner." He smiled then, real, raw, grateful. "You already have." The months passed gently, like pages turning. The house filled with small, healing rhythms. Morning coffee shared on the porch, laughter spilling from the kitchen, bedtime stories told in whispers. Natalie started classes at the local college, determined to study social work, to help children who grew up in homes like hers. Every evening when she returned, Robert would ask how her day went, and she would tell him everything, the lessons, the fears, the little triumphs. He'd listen with that same patient focus that had once made her fall silent in awe. On the anniversary of Patricia's passing, Robert took them both to the hilltop cemetery, where wildflowers grew between old stones. Abigail placed a daisy by her mother's grave and whispered something too soft to hear. Natalie stood beside them, her hand resting gently over Robert's. He looked at her then, the ache in his chest easing for the first time in years. That night, as they drove home under a sky streaked with the colors of dusk, he glanced at her and realized something profound. He was no longer surviving. He was living again. The warmth between them grew unspoken but undeniable, like spring sunlight seeping into frozen ground. Natalie still carried her scars, but in this house they were no longer shame. They were stories of survival, and Robert, who had once believed his heart was buried with his wife, began to understand that love, when true, doesn't replace, it expands. By the end of the year, their home had changed. The flowers in the garden had taken root. Abigail's laughter had become brighter. The air itself seemed lighter. Healing had settled over them like a soft blanket, invisible but ever-present. And though neither of them dared to call it love yet, every glance, every shared smile, every small kindness whispered the same truth. They were no longer two broken souls merely existing. They were becoming something whole. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon and the chimes sang their soft lullaby, Robert looked at Natalie and saw not the girl who had once sat alone in a ballroom, but the woman who had brought light back into his home. The story wasn't over. Something deeper waited on the horizon, quiet and patient, ready to bloom when the time was right. But for now, peace was enough. The warmth between them was enough. The gentle rhythm of life, stitched together with laughter and soft healing silences, was enough to remind them both that love, real love, begins not with a grand declaration, but with the simple, steady act of staying. Winter came softly that year, as if it, too, had decided not to disturb the fragile peace that had settled inside the Sinclair home. Frost traced gentle veins across the windows. The fireplace hummed like an old friend, and the house breathed warmth from every corner. Laughter, clinking dishes, soft footsteps, a lullaby of belonging. For Natalie, the months flowed like water, each day washing away the memory of cold marble floors and whispered cruelty. The mansion she had left behind became less a wound and more a distant echo, fading further each time she woke to Abigail's cheerful voice calling her down for breakfast. She had begun to find her rhythm in this new life. Mornings were slow and kind. She would make coffee while Robert read the paper, sunlight spilling in gold ribbons over his face. Abigail would rush in, her hair a wild halo, demanding pancakes shaped like stars. Natalie would laugh, really laugh, from deep in her chest, and Robert would catch himself staring, wondering when exactly her laughter had begun to sound like home. At night, she would stay up late at the small desk in her room, books scattered, studying casework notes for her social work classes. Sometimes Robert would knock softly and bring her tea, pretending he needed an excuse to check on her. They would talk quietly about little things, the way the moonlight hit the porch, the stories Abigail told at school, the first time he realized he wasn't angry at the world anymore. It was during one of those nights that something shifted. Natalie looked up from her papers to find him standing in the doorway, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a softness in his eyes that took her breath away. He smiled, tired but kind. "You should rest," he said. "So should you," she whispered, and for a heartbeat the air between them changed. No longer the easy comfort of friendship, but something warmer, deeper, almost sacred. They didn't move, didn't speak, only silence, heavy and fragile, stretching like the space before a first snowfall. He broke it gently, his voice a low hum. "You've made this house feel alive again." Natalie wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. So she only smiled, her heart trembling with gratitude and something she didn't dare name yet. As the weeks went on, their closeness grew in the quiet ways that love often does, in shared glances across the dinner table, in the gentle brush of fingers when passing a plate, in the way he'd wait up for her just to make sure she got home safe. The loneliness that had once wrapped around them both like winter fog was slowly replaced by warmth. They were still learning how to live again, each day a lesson in tenderness. Abigail, in her innocent way, seemed to sense what was blooming before either of them could admit it. She would grab Natalie's hand as they walked through the park and say, "Daddy smiles more when you're here." And when Natalie blushed, the little girl would laugh and skip ahead, leaving two adults behind who suddenly forgot how to breathe. The first snow fell in late December. Abigail squealed, running barefoot onto the porch before either of them could stop her. Natalie followed with a blanket, laughing as she scooped the girl into her arms. Robert stood in the doorway, watching them, the image so pure it hurt. Two figures wrapped in light, snowflakes catching in Natalie's hair like tiny halos. He thought of Patricia for a fleeting moment, wondering if she was watching, and somehow he felt her there, not in sorrow, but in peace. That night, after Abigail had fallen asleep clutching a stuffed rabbit, Robert found Natalie sitting by the fire, reading. The glow painted her face in amber warmth. He sat beside her quietly, not wanting to disturb the calm, but she looked up and smiled. "You always sit like that," she teased softly, "as if you're afraid to break something." He chuckled, leaning back against the couch. "Old habit. Life taught me that good things are fragile." She set her book down, turning to him fully. "Maybe good things aren't fragile," she said. "Maybe they just need someone gentle enough to hold them right." Her words landed like a soft ache in his chest. He looked at her, really looked. The way her eyes glowed in the firelight, the small scar on her wrist, the curve of her smile that carried both strength and sorrow. He wanted to say something, to reach across the small space between them and take her hand. But before he could, she leaned forward and placed a log in the fire. The sparks danced up like little stars, scattering their light between them. "Abigail told me she wants to learn the piano," Natalie said, breaking the silence. Robert smiled. "She tells me something new every day. Yesterday it was astronomy. The day before, building a castle in the backyard." "She just wants to create beauty," Natalie murmured. "Maybe she gets that from her parents." The way she said parents made his throat tighten. For so long it had just been him. One parent trying to fill two spaces, carrying grief like a second skin. But now, hearing her say it so naturally, it didn't sound wrong. It sounded right, like a melody that had always been waiting for harmony. Weeks later, after the holidays had passed and the snow began to melt, Natalie received her acceptance letter from the university. She stood on the porch, paper trembling in her hand, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. Robert found her there, confusion giving way to pride when she showed him the letter. "I got in," she said breathlessly. "They offered me the scholarship." He laughed, pulling her into his arms before he even thought about it. "You did it." For a heartbeat, the world stilled, the warmth of his embrace, the scent of cedar and rain, the sound of her laughter against his chest. When he finally released her, she stayed close, neither of them wanting to step back. That night, Abigail made a banner from colored paper and glitter that read, "Congratulations, Aunt Natalie." They celebrated with pizza and root beer floats. Natalie cried again, overwhelmed by the love that filled the little house. No one mocked her tears. No one told her to be grateful for less than she deserved. Later, after the dishes were done and Abigail had fallen asleep on the couch, Natalie stepped out onto the porch, the acceptance letter still folded in her hand. The night was soft, crickets humming in the distance. Robert joined her quietly, 2 mugs of cocoa in his hands. He handed one to her, and their fingers brushed, a touch so small yet charged with something powerful. "You changed everything," she said quietly. "I was disappearing, Robert. You made me feel real again." He looked at her, his expression unreadable but full of emotion. "You did that yourself. I just reminded you where to look." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of gratitude, of quiet longing, of all the words they weren't yet brave enough to speak. Then, softly, she said, "I never thanked you properly. Not for that night, not for all the nights after." "You don't have to," he replied. "You're here. That's enough." But she shook her head, stepping closer. "It isn't just about being here. It's about what this place means, what you and Abigail gave me." Her eyes glistened in the moonlight. "You gave me home." He reached out then, his hand finding hers. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything they'd both lost and everything they'd begun to rebuild. His thumb brushed her knuckles, slow and reverent, as though afraid she might vanish. Patricia would have wanted this, he said, voice rough with honesty. She believed in love that healed, not replaced. Tears shimmered on Natalie's lashes, but she smiled through them. Then I hope she knows how grateful I am. I think she does, he murmured. They sat together beneath the starlit sky, hands entwined, the air between them warm despite the chill. Every breath felt softer, every heartbeat quieter, as if the universe itself was giving them permission to rest. When they finally went back inside, the fire had burned low, its embers glowing like secrets. Natalie glanced at him one last time before heading upstairs, the promise of something unspoken lingering between them like perfume. In her room she paused by the window. The moonlight poured over the quilt, over the books, over the soft, ordinary beauty of the life she'd found here. She thought of the girl who had once sat behind a palm tree at her sister's wedding, unseen, unwanted, unloved. That girl was still part of her, but she was no longer broken. She had become someone new, softer, stronger, loved. Downstairs, Robert sat alone for a while, staring into the embers. His heart was no longer heavy. It beat steady and full, carrying both his past and his future in the same rhythm. He looked toward the stairs where her footsteps had faded and smiled to himself, a quiet, knowing smile that spoke of peace. The world outside was still cold, but the little house was alive with warmth. Laughter waiting to be born, stories waiting to be told, and the slow, healing miracle of two souls finding their way toward each other, one gentle breath at a time. Spring arrived like a whispered promise, gentle, green, and full of second chances. The Sinclair garden bloomed again, wildflowers rising from the soil where Natalie's hands had pressed hope into the earth months before. The air smelled of rain and lilacs, sunlight dripped like honey through the open windows, and laughter often floated out from the porch where Abigail and Natalie painted little stones for the garden path. Life had taken on a rhythm that felt both ordinary and sacred. Mornings were for school runs and shared coffee. Evenings were for stories and quiet dinners, for the three of them gathered beneath the soft hum of the kitchen light. Yet, beneath the peaceful routine, something deeper was unfolding, quiet, patient, inevitable. Robert found himself noticing the smallest things about her, the way she hummed absent-mindedly when cooking, the way sunlight made her hair glow amber, the way her eyes softened when she looked at Abigail. And Natalie, though she told herself she was content simply to belong, could no longer ignore the pull of his presence, the steadiness that anchored her, the tenderness that healed what others had broken. One evening, after a long day of work, Robert came home to find the house filled with the smell of baked bread and rosemary. Abigail was sprawled on the floor, colouring a picture, her hair a chaotic halo of curls. Natalie looked up from the kitchen counter, smiling in that quiet, luminous way that made him forget the weariness of the world. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, brushing flour from her arm. He stepped closer, inhaling the warmth that always seemed to follow her, something soft, something alive. "It smells like heaven in here," she laughed lightly. "It's just bread." "It's never just anything when you make it." The words slipped out before he could catch them. Her smile faltered for half a heartbeat, then deepened, shy and real. The air between them trembled, charged with something that had waited too long. At dinner, Abigail chattered endlessly, unaware of the quiet glances exchanged over her head. Afterward, she insisted on a story before bed, one that Natalie told in her soft, soothing voice, about a bird that lost a wing but learned to fly again with help from the wind. Robert listened from the doorway, the words sinking into him like a prayer. When Abigail finally fell asleep, Natalie tucked the blanket around her and whispered good night. She turned to find Robert still standing there. Neither spoke as they walked downstairs, the house dim except for the golden light from the fireplace. He poured them both tea, though neither of them drank it. The silence stretched, tender and fragile, filled with all the things they'd both been afraid to say. Natalie sat curled on the couch, her legs tucked under her, eyes reflecting the flicker of the fire. "I got a call from the university today," she said softly. "They offered me a position in the mentorship program, part-time, while I finish my degree. I'd be helping other students from trauma backgrounds." Robert smiled, pride lighting his face. "That's perfect for you." "I almost didn't apply," she admitted. "I thought maybe I should stay here, help more with Abigail, with the house." He frowned gently. "You shouldn't hold yourself back for us." "It's not that," she said quickly. "It's just, I finally have something that feels like family. I don't want to lose it." His breath caught. "You won't." The quiet that followed was almost too full. Natalie looked down at her hands, the single one resting in her lap, the sleeve of her sweater falling loosely over the scar where the other used to be. "You say that like it's simple," she murmured. "It is," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You belong here." She lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze. There it was again, that pull, that impossible tenderness. He moved closer, the distance between them shrinking to a heartbeat. "Natalie," he said, her name soft and reverent. Her pulse fluttered. "Yes?" He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was feather-light, hesitant, sacred. "I've tried to tell myself this is just friendship," he said quietly. "That maybe it's too soon, too complicated, too everything. But every time you walk into a room, it feels like I can breathe again." She didn't speak. She couldn't. The fire crackled softly, and the scent of rain from outside drifted through the open window. He looked at her as if afraid she might fade like a dream. "You don't have to say anything," he added. "I just needed you to know." Her heart ached, not with fear, but with the weight of love too big for words. Slowly she reached up, her fingertips tracing the edge of his jaw, the stubble rough beneath her touch. "You've given me back everything I thought I'd lost," she whispered. "How could I not love you for that?" The world seemed to still. Then, without hesitation, he leaned forward and kissed her, gently, reverently, as if asking permission with every breath. Her eyes fluttered closed, the warmth of his lips melting into hers, quiet and tender, a promise spoken without words. It wasn't a kiss of urgency or conquest. It was one of healing, of two broken lives stitching themselves together. When they parted, their foreheads rested together, both of them trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer wonder of being found. Robert exhaled slowly, a smile tugging at his lips. "You have no idea how long I've wanted to do that." Her laugh was soft, breathless, glowing. "Maybe I do," he chuckled, brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. "So what now?" She thought for a moment, then smiled. That quiet, knowing smile that had become her strength. Now we live, we grow, we heal. And they did. The days that followed unfolded like a dream, the house filled with a new kind of laughter, gentle and real. They moved around each other easily, as if they'd been doing it for a lifetime. Sometimes, when Robert worked late, Natalie would fall asleep on the couch waiting for him, and he would find her curled beneath a blanket, the firelight dancing over her face. Other nights they sat together on the porch, speaking little, just listening to the crickets and the distant wind, their fingers intertwined. Abigail, ever intuitive, seemed to sense the change without needing words. She began calling Natalie Mum one morning, completely unprompted, as if it had always been the truth. The word struck Natalie like sunlight, filling her eyes with tears. Robert said nothing, just reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Love didn't erase their scars. It illuminated them. There were still hard days, moments when Natalie's past returned like a shadow, or when Robert woke from dreams of Patricia's laughter. But they carried those ghosts gently, knowing that love was not a replacement, but a continuation. Months later, when summer came and the garden was thick with wild roses, Robert surprised her. He took her out to the porch at sunset, the air thick with the scent of jasmine. In his hands he held a small wooden box. "I was going to wait," he said, smiling nervously. "But you've never been someone I could wait for." Her heart stumbled as he opened the box, revealing a simple silver ring. No diamonds, no grand gesture, just sincerity shining in his eyes. "Natalie," he said, his voice trembling, "you walked into my life when I didn't think I deserved another chance. You turned my home into a sanctuary again. You've loved my daughter as your own, and somehow you've loved me too. So, if you'll have me—" She didn't let him finish. She reached up, tears spilling down her cheeks, and kissed him, soft, sure, full of joy. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. 1,000 times, yes." Abigail burst through the door then, having overheard enough to understand, and squealed with delight. "I knew it! I knew it!" she cried, wrapping her arms around them both. Robert laughed, his eyes wet, and Natalie held them close, her heart overflowing. That night, after Abigail had fallen asleep in her excitement, they stood together on the porch once more. The moon hung low and golden over the fields, and fireflies glimmered in the grass. Robert slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly. "It's not much," he said softly. "It's everything," she replied. He drew her into his arms, and she leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. Strong, calm, alive. The air smelled of earth and rain and beginnings. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in the kind of silence that doesn't need filling, a silence that heals, a silence that says, "You are home now." And as the wind brushed against them, carrying the fragrance of the blooming garden, Natalie finally understood. Love wasn't something you earned or proved. It was something you found when two hearts decided to stop running. The night stretched on, soft and infinite, and when dawn came, the first light touched them both. Warm, golden, full of promise. It was a new beginning, gentle and sure, written not in grand declarations, but in every small act of kindness that had brought them here. Their story had started with 6 quiet words in a room full of cruelty. "Act like you're with me, please." Now, those words meant something far greater. You are with me, always. The wedding took place in their own backyard on a soft September afternoon, wrapped in the golden hush that only late summer brings. Daisies and lavender lined the edges of the grass where Abigail had insisted on planting them, and ribbons of cream fabric fluttered gently from the oak tree Robert had planted years ago with Patricia. The air smelled of cinnamon cake, cut grass, and promise. No orchestra, no chandeliers, no designer gowns, just the quiet music of laughter and wind chimes, and the feeling of peace that comes when two weary souls finally stop wandering. Natalie stood at the edge of the porch, her dress simple white cotton, handmade by a neighbor who refused to take payment. The fabric caught the light like water. She'd woven a crown of wildflowers into her hair, daisies and soft green ivy that brushed her shoulders when she turned. Robert was at the far end of the yard, talking with Agnes, Matthew's grandmother, who had insisted on attending despite her age. She had told him with a wink, "I was there when your story began. I wouldn't miss seeing it end right." Abigail ran barefoot between them, clutching a small basket of rose petals she had picked herself that morning. She'd taken her duties as flower girl very seriously, though the petals were crumpled from being played with all afternoon. When she reached Natalie, she stopped to catch her breath, face flushed and bright. "You look like a princess," she said earnestly. Natalie knelt, brushing a curl from the child's forehead. "And what are you, then?" Abigail grinned. "The luckiest flower girl in the whole world." Robert turned then, as if he'd felt their laughter through the air. When his eyes found Natalie's, the noise of the world disappeared. The months between that lonely wedding and this moment unfurled inside him like a song. Every look, every smile, every night spent talking until the stars faded. He thought of Patricia for the briefest moment, not with pain, but with gratitude. She'd have loved her, he thought. She'd have wanted this. Her Margaret from accounting stood near the small archway they'd built out of old wood and white paint, a book in her hands. She'd gotten ordained online specifically for this, her mascara already threatening to run. The few guests they'd invited, close friends, neighbors, the kind of people who'd loved them quietly all along, took their seats on folding chairs. The music began, a simple melody played by a friend on guitar. Robert's breath caught when Natalie began to walk toward him, her steps slow, steady, each one carrying the weight of everything she'd survived and everything she was about to become. When she reached him, the world stilled. The wind seemed to pause, the air thick with sunlight and awe. She looked up at him, eyes shining, and whispered, "I'm home." He took her hand, holding it like something sacred. Margaret's voice wavered as she began, "Love doesn't erase the past. It doesn't fix what was broken. It simply chooses, again and again, to be gentle with the pieces." The vows they spoke were not rehearsed. Robert's words were quiet, trembling at the edges. "You were light in a place that forgot what light looked like. You made me remember that kindness isn't weakness, and grief isn't the end of love. It's the space where love waits to begin again. You are my beginning." Natalie's voice was steady, though tears traced down her cheek. "You found me when I was invisible, and you saw me as whole. You taught me that love isn't something you earn, it's something you build, one act of grace at a time. You and Abigail are my every tomorrow." When they kissed, Abigail threw the petals into the air with such enthusiasm that half of them blew straight back into her face. The guests laughed, and Robert pulled Natalie close, pressing his forehead to hers. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. The reception was small, full of warmth and mismatched chairs. They danced barefoot on the grass, the sunset wrapping them in a soft gold glow. Agnes gave a speech that made everyone cry, reminding them that some stories are written not by chance, but by courage. "This isn't a fairy tale," she said, her old voice cracking. "It's better, it's real, and it's proof that love can bloom again, even in soil that's been scorched." Later, after the guests had gone and the lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, Robert and Natalie sat on the porch steps, her head resting against his shoulder. The garden hummed with crickets, and Abigail's sleepy giggle drifted through the open window behind them. "Do you ever think about them?" Natalie asked softly. "The Whitfields?" She nodded. "Sometimes," he said, "not out of anger, just hoping they learn something, hoping they stop pretending love is something you can buy." Natalie smiled faintly. "Agnes said their company never recovered." "I heard," he said. "I don't feel sorry for them. I feel sorry for who they could have been." She was quiet for a while. "Maybe they taught me something too," she said finally. "That even cruelty can't kill what's meant to grow. It just forces you to plant somewhere else." Robert looked down at her, pride swelling in his chest. "You've become everything they said you couldn't." "I just stopped believing them," she said, "and started believing you." He kissed the top of her head, tasting the faint scent of lavender. "Then promise me you'll never forget that." "I won't," she whispered. The moon rose higher, casting silver light over their joined hands. The porch creaked softly beneath them, and somewhere in the yard the wind stirred the chimes she had hung months ago. The melody drifted through the night, soft and healing, like a lullaby written by time itself. They stayed there long after midnight, speaking of small things, the classes she would take next semester, the summer trip they'd promised Abigail, the stray cat that had taken up residence under the porch. Each word was simple, but together they formed a rhythm of peace, a language of belonging. When they finally went inside, the house was quiet, bathed in moonlight. Abigail was asleep on the couch, one hand still clutching her little basket of petals. Robert lifted her gently and carried her to bed, his movements tender, practiced, full of love. Natalie watched from the doorway, her heart swelling at the sight. The man who had once been broken by loss, now whole again through love. In her room, she stood before the window and looked out over the yard where they had just promised forever. The lanterns still glowed faintly, flickering like stars caught between earth and heaven. The flowers she'd planted months ago swayed in the night breeze, and for the first time she felt she had roots. Downstairs, Robert lingered by the fireplace, staring into the embers. When she came down quietly, he turned, smiling, as if he'd been waiting for her all along. "I can't sleep," she said softly. "Neither can I," he admitted. They stood there in the golden glow of the dying fire, saying nothing. He reached out, took her hand, and led her outside. The night was cool, the grass damp beneath their bare feet. Above them, the stars scattered across the sky in careless beauty. "Do you believe in miracles?" he asked. "I believe in moments," she said, "and this feels like one." He pulled her close, her head resting against his chest, his heartbeat steady under her ear. They swayed slowly beneath the open sky. No music but the sound of the wind and the faint hum of crickets. She closed her eyes, breathing him in, the scent of wood smoke, earth, and something tender she could never quite name. For a long while neither moved, neither spoke. There was no need. When he finally whispered, "I love you," she smiled against his chest. "I know," she said. "You've been saying it all along." The stars watched silently as they stood there, wrapped in each other, the night carrying their quiet joy out into the world. Inside, the clock ticked softly, marking the hours of a life they would now share. The house that had once been filled with grief now pulsed with warmth, laughter, and the kind of stillness that only comes after long healing. And as dawn began to rise over the horizon, washing the sky in pale gold, Natalie lifted her face to the light and whispered to herself a promise, to keep choosing love every single day, in all the small, unremarkable ways that make a life sacred. The sun touched the garden, the wind stirred the chimes again, and the world seemed to whisper back, "You're home now." Years later, the house still stood at the edge of town, its white paint faded a little by the sun, its porch creaking softly with every breeze. But inside it was alive, filled with the quiet rhythm of a family that had learned how to build love out of ashes. Photographs lined the hallway walls, Abigail's school concerts, holidays at the lake, birthdays spent around a lopsided cake. Each picture told a story not of perfection, but of presence, laughter, mistakes, forgiveness, the beauty of trying again. Natalie stood in the kitchen that morning, barefoot on the cool wood floor, stirring honey into her tea. Her hair was streaked faintly with silver now, but her smile hadn't changed. It was still that same soft, steady light that had once pierced through a ballroom of cruelty and found its way to Robert's heart. Through the open window came the sound of birds, of children laughing somewhere down the road, of the wind brushing through the wildflowers she and Abigail had planted so many years ago. Robert came in quietly, his hand brushing her shoulder in the familiar way that said, "I'm here." He was older too, lines at the corners of his eyes, a calm that came only after walking through storms and surviving them. He leaned against the counter, watching her with that same quiet reverence he always had. "You're up early," he said, voice rough with sleep. "Habit," she smiled. "Abigail's graduation is today. I wanted to make her breakfast before she leaves." He reached for the mug beside hers, his fingers grazing hers briefly. "You're nervous for her?" "She's my heart walking around in the world," Natalie said softly. "I think a little part of me will always be nervous." Robert chuckled. "She's more ready than either of us ever were." "She gets that from you." He shook his head, smiling. "No, she gets it from you, the way you kept moving forward even when everything told you to stop." The screen door creaked then, and Abigail appeared, grown now, radiant in her cap and gown, her face lit by the same sunlight that had once crowned her parents' wedding day. She hugged them both, laughing, teasing them for crying, her arms strong and warm. "You two are embarrassing," she said, but her voice was full of affection. "You'll make me cry before I even get my diploma." Natalie pressed a hand to her cheek, her eyes shining. "We already cried enough for one lifetime. These are happy tears." They drove to the ceremony together, the car filled with laughter and the faint scent of vanilla from the flowers Abigail had pinned to her gown. At the school field, rows of chairs shimmered under the afternoon sun. The air buzzed with joy and nostalgia. Natalie and Robert sat together, hands entwined, as they watched their daughter take the stage. When Abigail reached the podium, the crowd hushed. She stood tall, her voice steady, her smile wide. "When I was 7, she began, "my father went to a wedding and came home with the woman who became my mother." A ripple of laughter spread through the audience, but she continued, her tone softening. "He told me once that real love isn't about rescuing someone, it's about walking beside them when the world tries to make them walk alone. My mother taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing love again, even when it's hard. She showed me that family isn't about blood. It's about kindness, patience, and choosing to stay." Robert's hand tightened around Natalie's. She blinked back tears, her heart so full it almost hurt. Abigail went on, her voice trembling now. "My mum lost her parents in an accident, her arm in the wreck, and her faith in people for a long time. But she never lost her kindness. She gave it to me, to everyone around her. And my dad, he taught me what quiet strength looks like. Together, they built a home where love was never forced, never earned, just freely given. That's the kind of love I want to spend my life creating." The applause was thunderous, echoing across the open sky. Robert brushed a tear from Natalie's cheek, his thumb lingering there for a moment. "She's yours," he whispered. "She's ours," Natalie said, her voice breaking into a smile. After the ceremony, they lingered by the garden near the stage, where Abigail posed for photos with her friends. The late afternoon light turned everything gold, the air, the leaves, the proud faces of parents. Natalie leaned into Robert, resting her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever think," she murmured, "about that first night we met? How something so small could change everything?" He smiled faintly. "6 words," he said. "That's all it took." "Act like you're with me, please," she whispered back, the words a memory, a benediction. He kissed her temple, his voice warm. "And now, you'll never have to pretend again." They went home that evening to a house full of people, neighbors, friends, the children they'd fostered over the years, the ones who still came back to visit because the Sinclairs had become their home too. Laughter filled the rooms, music played softly from an old speaker, and in the kitchen someone had set a cake covered in daisies on the counter. It wasn't perfect. It leaned slightly to one side, but it was beautiful. As night fell, they gathered on the porch. The air smelled of rain and honeysuckle. Fireflies blinked across the yard. Abigail sat between them, leaning her head on her mother's shoulder. "I think this is what happiness looks like," she said quietly. Natalie smiled. "Not the loud kind," she said. "The gentle kind that stays." Robert put an arm around them both, his heart swelling with gratitude. "It's the kind that grows where love decides to stay rooted." The stars began to appear, one by one. The same sky that had once looked cold and distant now felt close, tender, like an old friend. The breeze moved through the chimes, singing the song of their years together, the laughter, the healing, the grace that had carried them from pain to peace. Inside, the house glowed warm and alive. On the mantel sat a framed photograph of their wedding day, the ink beginning to fade. Next to it was a newer picture, the 3 of them standing in front of the university gates, arms wrapped around each other, smiling without reservation. Natalie looked at it one last time before heading upstairs that night, her fingers brushing the frame. So much had changed, so much had healed, but the heart of it all remained the same. Love that began not in grand gestures, but in small acts of courage. When she lay down beside Robert, the window open to the night air, she whispered, "I think we did it." "We built something good." He turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No," he said softly. "We built something true." Outside, the crickets sang, the garden swayed gently in the wind, and the moonlight touched everything it could reach. Their story, once born of pain, now glowed with the quiet holiness of redemption. They had not simply found love, they had chosen it, again and again, every single day. And somewhere in the deep of the night, as sleep carried them into dreams, the world itself seemed to exhale, a long, healing breath of peace. If you've ever felt unseen, if you've ever sat at a table where no one saved you a chair, remember this story. Remember that love does not always arrive with perfection or thunder. Sometimes it begins with a small act of kindness, a single voice saying, "You can sit with me." If this story touched your heart, leave a light behind. Click the like, write your thoughts in the comments, or subscribe to stay close to the warmth of these healing tales. Every word you share helps another heart remember. No one is ever truly alone.